Good day. My name is Susan, and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to the Big Book Awakening 12-Step Weekend. This meeting intends to follow the courteous principles of privacy and anonymity. But if you feel your privacy is at risk, please disconnect now. The Big Book Awakening weekend in the steps is being recorded to help continue to carry the message. We only use the recorded audio portion of our session. We welcome all 12-step programs. This conference is based on the daily meeting that started last year as a result of the physical meetings closing. The meeting immediately grew to 7 days a week, sharing our experience using the Big Book Awakening process, going through the Big Book. If you are new, we are glad you're here, and welcome all questions. The purpose of this weekend is to celebrate the fellowship growing up around us, share how we have recovered, and most importantly, introduce people to the Big Book Awakening process. For more information and great audios, check out bbaworks.com. We will post the link in the chat bar during this meeting. I will lead us in the set-aside prayer, followed by 1 minute of silent meditation to bring our spirits together. God, please enable me to set aside everything I think I know for an open mind and a new experience. Help me see the truth about this conference, the 12 steps, and my disease. Our speaker this afternoon will be Pat T., sharing his history of Big Book Awakening and AA beginning, followed by questions. And Pat, I am turning it over to you.
Susan, thanks. Hi, everybody. Pat, alcoholic. I am recovered. Good to see everybody. I see some of my NorCal group up there. I see Patty Way. I see a lot of familiar faces. Michael, thank you from the bottom of my heart. All you guys are doing and putting this on. Man, I don't know if anybody heard. I mean, I was busy this morning, but Nathan last night blew the roof off of the house. He absolutely killed it. And I think, you know, if you get a chance, I mean, all of the speakers all day long have a deep and effective experience in this work. And Tyla is sharing main speaker tonight, and Leanne is speaking on Sunday afternoon. I mean, you just got a great bunch of folks. So happy to be here. And Michael, before I start, just give me a thumbs up that I'm right or I'm wrong. You want me to shut down as far as speaking at about 12:45, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yes.
Okay, because this is an hour period, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, listen, you guys better buckle up because I got a lot to share with you. There's a lot of history. This is amazing. So I'm sitting in meditation this morning, and I'm talking to God about sharing, and I'm overwhelmed. I mean, I had tears this morning. I was talking to Karen, my wife, about this. I am absolutely overwhelmed by the history of BBA and what it's done personally in my life, what this process has done in literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people's lives across the world. The miracle of this program is it's not personality centered. It's about the book. It's about the Big Book. It's about having an experience with the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, sufficient that you and I can recover from a seemingly hopeless condition of mind and body. And that is a permanent recovery. That is not temporary. It's not trying to hang on one day at a time. That was never the design inside of the Big Book Awakening. Never designed inside of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I'm going to read to you what came to me this morning, and it's a couple paragraphs, but I think it sets the stage for what we're going to talk about. And then I'll give you the outline of how we're going to approach this Big Book Awakening history. So here it is. The history of BBA is that of God working through individuals who believed studying the Big Book as a textbook would open the world of freedom, love, strength, and happiness, because they believed that the Big Book is a roadmap to the consciousness of the presence of God in their lives. It's a treasure map, which followed results in the most intimate, loving, powerful relationship imaginable with the living God of the universe, a God who is for us, not against us, a God who can recreate, transform, and revolutionize our lives. Yep, I believe him. That's been my experience. Come with me and test this for yourselves, the great adventure. Thank you, God. I love you. And then I wrote this other paragraph. The history is alive with men and women who have experienced this. They dared to believe that God could do for them the impossible in their lives. They were right. And they have laid down a trail, a treasure map to be followed, filled with adventure for all who would come after them. Okay? So that's the opening that God sort of directed me to. And I feel really strongly about it. Every word that I just read, I believe to the bottom of my innermost being. And so we're going to talk about some people. This history is more than dates and times and events. It's about people and their hearts. And so the people we're going to talk about, we're going to major on a guy named Mac Cheater. You're going to hear about Mac Cheater in the Golden Slippers. We're going to hear about an AA International Convention that happened in Denver in 1975. We're going to hear about an AA group called the Denver Young People's Thursday Night. That's going to become a critical component. Then we're going to hear about some figures in history, Don Pritz and Gary Brown and Paul Martin and Bob Olson and Lynn Vernon. We're going to hear about Don Pritz's sponsees, a guy by the name of Joe Hawk, another guy by the name of Mark Houston. And then we're going to talk about some of the experiences that Joe Hawk had in terms of 5 incredibly powerful people. And by the way, I only know 4 of them, but there's, of the 5, incredibly powerful, deep, God-centered, big book thumpers that Joe Hawk went through the steps for the first 5 years after he went through the steps with Don Pritz. And then we're going to talk about Joe Hawk's amends tour to, of all places, Santa Monica, California. And in Santa Monica, California, he meets a guy named Dan Sherman. Who would figure? And then we're going to hear about Dan Sherman, how he interacted with Joe as a sponsor, as Joe being his sponsor. And then we're going to hear about Joe and Mark, and Joe Hawk and Mark Houston doing big book workshops all over the country for years and years and years, and how they began to use tapes in Dan's big book awakening as leave behinds for the groups they went to and had these conferences. I'm so excited. I want to hear this just as much as you guys. I hope you do. So with that general introduction, I cannot wait to start this puppy off. So you guys all ready? Thumbs up if you're ready. All right, man, here we go. Okay, so we're going to start out with a brief history of how we even got to Mac Cheater, because Mac Cheater is going to be really important. But hang in here with me. I'm going to give you a couple dates and a couple pieces of information. This is all being recorded, so please listen. Don't worry about taking notes. Just enjoy. I mean, it was a delight to put this together. So AA starts in 1935 with Bill Wilson. And then Dr. Bob and Bill, Bill Dotson becomes AA number 3. And then Paul Stanley, who's an insurance salesman in 1936, meets Dr. Bob. And he meets him in January of 1936. But he doesn't stay sober right away. He goes out on the beer experiment, as he describes it. And then he comes back in 1936 July, and he surrenders to this program, and he struggles with the God idea in general for quite a while, until later on in that year, Paul goes, he's almost bankrupt, and he's struggling. And remember, it's during the Depression era. So he thinks, well, I'm going to go to the bank and try to get a loan for my practice, for my business. So he goes to the bank, and he is collapsing. He is collapsing under the weight and the anxiety and the worry and the fear. And he ends up spilling the beans about his condition to the banker. And the banker, to his surprise, says, Paul, I already know all about you. And I also know that you're not a guy to be trusted with money. You're not a guy that has a history of paying money back. And you think that when you came in here that your problem is money. And I'm here to tell you, Paul, your problem's not money. See, he didn't know this, but Paul Stanley ran into an Oxford group member. Wow. How did that happen? And so this banker says to Paul, said, your problem is you believe your resources are external. You believe that you need money to be happy, joyous, and free. You believe that you have to have a job that's paying you well, and you do not. Your source has to be God. God reliant, God centered, and God everything from here on out in your life, Paul, or you are never going to live happy, joyous, and free. Now, Paul, I like you, and I am going to do everything in my power at this bank to get the loan for you. Can you believe that? He says, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it or not, but if you go out from here taking the advice I've given you, you won't need to have this loan, whether or not it comes through. You won't need anybody. You won't need any other thing. You won't need a group. All you'll need is God. So Paul, with that, I send you on your way, and whatever God happens to do with this loan, God will do. Wow. That's the start of where we're going in this whole program. So Paul, that's enough of Paul for a little bit, but the important thing is Paul Stanley ends up sponsoring a guy named Paul Martin. And Paul Martin is a guy that died with 62 years of sobriety in 2002. And he was a boxer kind of guy, and he was a guy that Dan Sherman actually knew. And so Dan Sherman, who wrote the Big Book Awakening, and we'll talk about Dan a lot here in a little bit. Wow, Dave Martell, you have a vague resemblance of Dan Sherman. I'm just blown away just looking at that picture for a second. Anyway, hi Dave. Anyway, so Paul Martin, he most of his sobriety is up in Chicago, and we're going to hear more about Paul here in a little bit and how he got to Chicago. But Paul Martin was a big believer in the Big Book, and he was a Big Book thumper, and he had this concept of multiple fifth steps. In other words, you read your fifth steps to a lot of different people, not just one. And Joe Hawk was a big proponent of that as well. And so Paul Martin ends up, Paul Martin ends up in Colorado during a period of his life. And just before he comes to Colorado, Paul sponsors a guy named Gary Brown. And Gary Brown is going to be a big figure. So Paul Martin sponsors a guy named Gary Brown in Indiana. And Gary Brown, with only 4 years of sobriety, now Gary Brown gets sober in 1965. And Gary Brown is in Denver, Colorado. And Don Pritz is just fresh out of prison. He's only a couple years sober. Gary Brown's 4 years sober. Don Pritz is only 2 years sober. He got sober in 1967. And Gary Brown becomes Don Pritz's sponsor. And he has this lineage of Big Book. And Don Pritz, just for a quick background, he was a felon in Colorado State Prison. And he was the first felon released from prison that was allowed to go back in, unescorted, unsecured, to be a full-time employee of the Colorado State Penal Institution. And his job was drug and alcohol counseling. Seems appropriate, doesn't it? And so he was also the guy that would go to the court with alcoholics, much like Ebby Thatcher going to court and having Shep Cornell and Seaber Graves standing up there with him, Roland Hazard in the background, and saying, Judge, give this guy a chance. I've got a program. I've got a solution. And Don Pritz would take these guys and start taking them through the work. So that was sort of the background. And then Don Pritz gets sober in 67, and he died in 2005, and 38 years of sobriety. And then when Don Pritz and Gary Brown got together, they both attended a group called the Denver Thursday Night Young Peoples. Okay, that was the group that they all attended. And so everything's going along swimmingly, and they're just doing their stuff, moseying through the book and doing their Big Book stuff. And then along comes along comes the International AA Convention. Okay, so now we're going into the International AA Convention of 1975. And one of the speakers at the AA International Convention from Winnipeg, Canada, is a guy named Mac Cheater. Who's Mac Cheater? And why would the AA International Convention want this guy there? Mac was now 23 years sober. He was dishonorably discharged, but he still had his military pension from Canada. But he was a Canadian aviator during the war. And he got sober. Mac Cheater got sober in 1952. And no, I don't know who Mac's sponsor is. It's Canadian. I can't remember the guy's name, and he's not really related to the lineage of Paul Martin or Paul Stanley or anybody else. So that connectedness, I'm not sure how it happened. Anyway, not even saying it did happen. But here's the point. Mac Cheater gets sober in 1952, and he was a bad drunk, and his life was in shambles, and he was desperate. And he hooked up with a sponsor that knew the big book. And that guy took him through the book. He took him through the book like it was a textbook, turning statements into questions. Sound familiar? And he took Mac Cheater through this book, and Mac Cheater became like a Navy SEAL. He became the guy. He understood it. He had a spiritual experience. He had a spiritual awakening, conscious contact with God. He is on fire. Inside of Mac's home group in Winnipeg are about a dozen, maybe 30, I can't remember, I think it was a dozen, an even dozen. And there's a group inside of the group that these guys were almost laughed at. They were shunned. They were looked down upon because they were slippers. They were the guys that could not stay sober. They were the guys that were relapsing year after year after year after year. Can anybody relate to that feeling? You bet. That's not the way of AA. The way of AA is love and patience and kindness and tolerance and sharing this message of depth and weight, saying we have no power to stay sober on our own. The only power comes from God of our understanding as we uncover this relationship with God as a result of doing this work out of his textbook. Mac believed that to his heart. So these 12 guys came to Mac because they had heard him share in the meetings, even though they couldn't stay sober. And the one guy, his wife, he was too scared to approach Mac, so he had his wife call up Mac and say, Mac, my husband wants to talk to you. Would you entertain the possibility of having a group just for this guy, my husband, and some of his friends? And Mac said, have your guy call me. And so the guy calls. And Mac talks to him and he says, so what's your problem? He said, Mac, we can't stay sober and we know we're goners and we're going to die unless we get this. And we need somebody that has what you have. In other words, Mac was viewed by them as an page 18 kind of sponsor. His whole deportment shouted at the new man that he had the real answer. That's who Mac Cheater was. And so Mac says a very curious thing. He says, you know what? No way. Wait, let me back up. So the guy says to him, said, listen, we don't want to meet with the rest of the group because, they're all laugh at us and they're not going to take us seriously. We're not going to be able to answer questions or ask questions. So we want you to have a separate meeting just for us. And Mac says, no way. He said, AA is an open fellowship for all who need recovery. And he said, if you want just to be you 12, then you better pick a day and a time in a place where no one else will want to come. And so they said, we've got a day, time, and a place, 7 a.m., Sundays at church. and Matt goes, that's a pretty good, 2 out of 3 is good, but I'm not doing 7 a.m. with you guys. You're going to meet me at 8:30. So they started meeting at 8:30. And so Max said to him when they first got together, he said, listen, guys, I love you. I love you. And we are not going to go any faster than the slowest guy in this group. and we are going to go page by page, and we're going to find the questions in each page, and we're going to turn them into questions, and then we're going to talk about them. And when the book says write, we're going to write. When the book says consider, we're going to consider. When the book says question, we're going to answer the question. And that's how we're going to do it. And I'm going to stick with you through thick and thin. You can't get rid of me. I am committed to you. And so they start. And it goes on for, guess what? About 26, 28 weeks. Sound familiar? That's how long it takes to go through BBA. And all but one of the guys made it. And of the guys that made it, in 1956, they stayed sober for the rest of their lives. 11 out of 12. I would call that in excess of a 90 percentile recovery. I don't know about you guys. A little bit higher than what we see in AA today. And their lives changed so dramatically, and their families reassembled so wonderfully, and their business and their impact on Winnipeg was so phenomenal, it even got the attention of AA International. And they said, man, we have got to hear from the guy that started this. So Mac Cheater comes down to the 1975 convention and tells the story. And he says, listen, guys, it's not all that complicated. I just told him what I told you. And Mac tells the audience in Denver International Convention about this. And he said, here's the key. You love your people. You love your people. And you don't give up on them. And you read one page at a time. And you turn statements into questions. And what we found is that God does God stuff when we do that. That's my words, but it's basically what he was saying. And the result of that meeting at the AA International Convention was Don Pritz and 14 others in the Denver young people said, man, this guy is on fire. I cannot believe the recovery this guy has. We've got to have him. So you know what they did? They created a 14-person workshop. And Mac Cheater took them through the work. All but one of the 14 stayed sober for the rest of their lives, and that I do know for a fact. 13 of the 14 in Denver, Colorado in 1975 stayed sober for the rest of their lives. One guy, and man, I'm getting too excited here, but one of the guys didn't make it, and I've got his name in here somewhere. It's probably not all that important to talk about. I'll probably see it again in my notes, and I'll pull it back up. But all but one of the guys stayed sober for the rest of their lives. And the one guy that didn't make it, oh yeah, here he is, Eddie Dorkin. Eddie Dorkin did not stay sober, and he passed out in one of his alcoholic binges in the Colorado wilderness outside, and he froze to death. So not a very pretty story. But 13 of 14 made it. And so they started, that was the start of the genesis, if you will, of what was going on with BBA as we know it today. And so what happened next? So they started later on, you might have heard these words, Fellowship of the Spirit conferences. Those were started out of this original group of 13 that made it, and it goes on to this day. And so in 1975 is when Don Pritz and this international convention, they go through the work. And then Don Pritz in 1982 meets a guy named Joe Hawk. Joe Hawk has, I can't remember, 4 or 5 years of sobriety, and he is a bloody mess. He's almost insane. He's losing his mind. He does not have recovery. He is sober by the grace of God, but he is dying on the vine. He's insane. He's angry. Nobody wants to be around this guy. And as a last-ditch effort, Joe Hawk comes to Don Pritz, and he starts telling them his tale of woes, and Don stops him in the middle of his sentence. He says, good God Almighty, Joe, you better just stop talking. We got to pray right now. God, please set aside everything in Joe before he kills himself. And so loosely, that was the beginning of the set-aside prayer. It was made in a spirit of, God, we need you. Come now. We need you in this area of our lives. And so, you know what? God came because Joe ended up going through all the steps with Don Pritz, and it was magnificent. And then he comes back to Don the next year, in 1983, and he says, man, I want to go through the steps again. I got more stuff that I want to get through. You told me that this is a regular inventory. A business goes broke. We don't take a regular inventory every single year. You've told me to do that for the rest of my life. I'm back, Don, for more. And Don says a very curious thing. Joe, I've given you everything I've got. Go out and find the new guy and do it every year. Wow. You don't hear that in sponsorship. So Joe, you know who he gets? He gets Don Pritz was his first year. This guy named Frank McGibbon, who gave us in the BBA our third column of our fourth step. This extended third column is a product of Frank McGibbon's, who is a big time attorney in Denver and an ornery old sort. In his home group, I never ran into him, but I went to the home group a bunch. It was called York Street. And so he met with Frank McGibbons. And then the next guy he met with was Don Coyas out of Colorado Springs. Anybody know Don Coyas, that name? Yeah. Indian Red Path Tradition, wrote a book called, oh gosh, dang it. It's not Wholebriety, that's Dave Marquez. What was his book called? Whole Sobriety. Yeah, that's it, right? Hold it up. There it is. Wholebriety, thank you. Wellbriety, thank you, Percy. You're right on, buddy. I so appreciate you doing that. You are a God blessing, buddy. Thank you. And so he meets with Don Coyas. And Don Coyas, if you guys have never heard him, please go hear him. Don's responsible for me having part of my Indian Red Path tradition and part of my meditation called the Ada Ning, which means home within your heart, which is a place where God meets me. That's where my Papa meets me. And that's a direct result of Don Coyas. And so he meets with Don Coyas. So we got Don Pritz, Frank McGibbon, Don Coyas, and then he meets with Gary Brown. And he learns more in-depth work on the inventory process. He learned the fourth column work from Don Pritz. Don Pritz is the author of the fourth column work that we do in our inventory. Frank McGibbon is the author of the third column. Man, I'm getting excited, guys. This is so good. So Joe was brilliant in that he pieced together the best of all the people that he was sponsored by and went through the work with. Sounds a little bit like Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson took all the ideas from Oxford Group. He took them from Sam Shoemaker. He took them from Harry Thibault. He took them from Dr. Silkworth. He took them from Carl Jung. He put the ideas together. That's what Joe Hawk did with his way that he went through the work. And then Joe Hawk ends up going out he's making amends, and Joe is a fanatic, and I am too, and anybody that's in BBA is a fanatic. All amends means all amends, all. Not some, not most, not the convenient ones, not the ones I'm okay with, all. Dead or alive, all. So Joe Hawk is going, and he's serious about this stuff. And he says he has so many amends to do on the West Coast, he might as well go out there and live. So guess where he goes out to live? Santa Monica, California. And he's making his amends. And he, by the way, starts up some groups up in LA that are going to this day that are the stag meeting at Roxbury Stag Group, one of the oldest meetings in LA, a phenomenal meeting, phenomenal. It's a men's only meeting, but Joe started that meeting with a couple other folks. And wherever Joe touched, he just ended up, man, some cool things happen. So he is going to, he's in Santa Monica, and this is in 1989. And he meets this young guy named Dan Sherman. And Dan Sherman meets Joe, not as a sponsor to begin with, but he's sponsored by somebody else, and they're working on 10 and 11. And the sponsor says to Dan Sherman, hey, go find a step 10 and 11 meeting. That's what you need. And so Dan's looking in the AA directory of meetings, and he finds this meeting called Steps 10, 11, and 12 Group. Sounds like that's right on site, right? So he goes to this group, and I gotta read this to you. So he's looked at the directory, and he finds this meeting called 10, 11, and 12. Wow, all the other meetings were, he said, quote, Dan, this is Dan talking. He said, all the other meetings I'd been attending up till this new meeting that I just started going to, 10, 11, and 12, were like unsupervised group therapy. Talking about their problems and no solution, right? And man, he said you couldn't, and then this meeting, I show up, and you can't even talk in the meeting unless you had finished all of your amends. Are you kidding me? You couldn't even talk. You could ask questions, but you couldn't talk. And so he said you couldn't, so I couldn't finish my 9-step amends. You could only ask questions. And Dan was a newcomer, so he just listened. He said, boy, am I lucky I just listened, because the format of the meeting was they would invite speakers from all over that had long-term sobriety that were supposedly really well recovered, and they let them speak, and then there'd be a meditation at the beginning of the meeting, and then the speaker, and then there'd be questions, and then a meditation at the end of the meeting. Well, after the speaker got done speaking, the speaker didn't know this, but it really wasn't a question answer time. It was an interrogation time. And so these hardcores with Joe Hawk and all the rest of them would just pepper the ever-loving, whatever out of these poor speakers. And some of the speakers who are well recovered, it was fine, no big deal. It was like fellowship. And some of these other speakers who were imitators and just saying words because they had heard it somewhere else, maybe a little bit of group therapy thing going on, man, they would just be pounded. And Dan said, I really felt sorry for him. And so we'd go into the evening the meditation at the end of the meeting, and I'd open my eyes, and the speaker who had been pounded had left during the meditation so he wouldn't have to talk to anybody. So I can't say it was total love, but you get the drift of how intense the meeting was. And so, wow. I mean, so that's that deal. And so Dan says shortly thereafter, after meeting Joe, he says, hey, I have got to have you as my sponsor. You got to be my sponsor. So he starts going through the work with Joe Hawk. And Joe Hawk, this is in, holy cow, where are we? 1989. So 1989, he starts working with Joe Hawk. And he said, and Dan sort of, if you guys didn't know Dan was honestly one of my favorite people in the universe. I love Dan. I had the privilege for about 4 years of spending mostly every Tuesday and Thursday night with Dan. I'd had business in Santa Monica, in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, in the work I was doing. And I'd spend time, and we'd have dinner together, and then we'd go to his Tuesday night big group meeting. And then on Thursday nights, when I was getting ready to go home back to San Diego, I would go to his meeting. And the Thursday night meeting was much like that 10, 11, and 12 interrogation meeting. I mean, we would spend an hour on one paragraph. What does this mean to you? Well, what's your opinion? Why do you say that? I don't believe you. Where do you get that from? It's not in the big book. It was intense. Let me just put it that way. And too intense for me sometimes. I say, Dan, this is crazy. I love the debate. Dan would say, I love the debate. I love the critical thinking. I go, good for you, Dan. I love you dearly. I think I'll make Tuesday night my time I spend with you more often than not. So Dan starts meeting with Joe, and he'd go over to Joe Hawk's house, and he said, you got to picture this, people. Joe Hawk worked with people from morning till sunset. Just one after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, after another. Just like Don Pritz, just like Dan Sherman, just like a lot of people that you know. And Joe would get there. Here's the description. Joe would come in his casual clothes, sometimes his slippers and a house coat, and he would sit down at his table, and he would arrange in front of him on the coffee table lifesavers, cigarettes in a straight row, and usually he would have his dentures out because he had a full set. So you can just almost picture Joe speaking, right? And what he said, Dan described, he said, Joe would just rattle off the instructions out of the big book, and he would say, read the book, find the questions, write them in the big book, and come back and show me next week. And so they would do that. I mean, so Dan's assignment in one section of the book, each section, he told him it's a textbook, has to be studied in order. That's to become significant later on when he writes the big book, Awakening. But he says, each of the sections, he would go back to his house, and he was the only guy he knew that had a computer in 1989. He had an Apple computer, a Macintosh, or Apple, what kind did he say? I don't even know. What did he say? He said a computer. It was an Apple of some sort. Anyway, he would type the questions out just for his own, and then he would write them into his big book. And then he would come back to the meeting next week and he would read them, the questions he had discovered in that part of the text, and Joe would start laughing at him. Not overtly laughing, but he'd go, and he never qualified why he was doing that. Okay, good. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. And so he'd never qualify why he was sort of laughing at him, but he would keep on doing this week in and week out. And Dan said he just kept getting more instructions, and every session that he had with Joe was just basically Joe giving these instructions. Dan would come back and read the questions, and they would sort of talk about them, and he had an experience. And so when he got done with going through the work with Joe, he said, what I had was a big book full of questions, and I had a first-time experience which set me free. But then he said to himself, there's obviously some other stuff going on, because he said Joe's other sponsees, when they would show up, all they did was highlight the sentence in the big book. They didn't write it out, type it out, or anything else. And Joe never expected Dan to do the writing out the questions in his big book, never expected him to do any transcribing, never expected him to do any typing in the computer. And he just said to Dan later on, he said, but I just trusted God that God would lead you where you needed to go. And I never interfered with what God was doing. Was that beautiful? Wow. Could have shut him down, but he didn't. Dr. Silkworth, when Bill Wilson is saying, I had this white light experience, you think I'm crazy? You think I'm insane? And Silky looks at him and says, Bill, I don't know, but whatever you got's better than what you had. You better hang on to it. That same kind of open spirit of love and trust of God. So the instructions in the book, Dan said, took the whole time of the time with Joe. And so when he finally got through with the big book study with Joe, he went to him and he brought with him a stack of typed questions stapled together, and he handed them to Joe and he said, Joe, I'm going to give you all the questions that we came up with during our time. You just give these questions to your other sponsees, and then they won't have to meet with you at all. So it was a little bit of a resentment and a lot of bit of help that Dan wrote that. Do you get me on that? I don't want it to go away from here like Dan was really angry at Joe and it was terrible. That wasn't it. But there was a little bit of a stick in the side with Joe saying, listen, all you do is give me directions every time. Here, now they got the questions, so now your time could be spent talking and sharing experience. Wow, that'd be a cool thing. And so then I'm going to fast forward here. In 1991, he completes this work. He's 1991. There's a couple, he's going to meetings around town. 1987 or 1989, he's going through the work with Joe Hawk. 1991, 3 years have gone by. And Dan is getting to be known as a guy that has some depth and weight in his recovery. But he's getting tired of going through the unsupervised therapy sessions around town. So he's starting to do more and more of the 10, 11, and 12 meetings and less in mainstream AA. And some guys came to him, a couple guys came to him and said, hey, listen, would you take us through the work the way that you're doing it? We want what you have. And he said, sure. He said, but on the night they came to his apartment in Santa Monica, there weren't just 2 guys, there were 14. I don't know why that number 12, 14 seems to be the number, but it just is. And they went through the work. And what Dan did is he got out his questions and he said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do the same thing that Joe did with me. We're going to look at each page and we're going to turn statements into questions by you go out and find the questions. So he didn't give his work to them yet. He just simply said, you just go out and find the questions. And so they would come back each week and they would show Dan the questions they had. And the one guy that had more questions than anybody else was a security guard named Richard. And Richard had all day, every day to look at the big book and look at questions. But Dan said Richard tried really hard, but he just wasn't understanding the big book. The questions he was coming up with were not part of the big book. It was like, I don't even know where he was getting them, and they were just off. So Dan made a decision that he would type into his computer and then give out to everybody on a handout to them each week all the questions that he had done through Joe. And so the group of 14 became Dan's critiquing committee of the work. And Dan said, listen, where it's off, let me know. If you see this question in the big book, let me know. Let's talk about it. Let's have our experience. And so they did that for the next 26 weeks. Sound familiar? And he said in a talk that he did, and you could get it on bigBookAwakening.com. A lot of my materials from this one talk that he did in it was beautiful. If you have any questions, just call me and I'll get it to you. But it's bigBookAwakening.com, and it's Dan's sharing at Lynn's backyard. And he said, you know, my real motivation for turning that, giving everybody else those questions is because I wanted to see Richard get this. I just wanted to see Richard get it because he wasn't getting it, and I wanted to help him. Dan had the biggest heart of anybody I know. The guy was he was a love beast. He was just a big, snuggly love bear. That's all. He loved people, and he wanted people to get this message. So, needless to say, all of them got it. One, again, I don't know what this is about the one, but 13 of the 14 stayed sober for the rest of their lives and sponsored actively for the rest of their lives. Wow, are you kidding me? And so for the next 10 years, from 1991 to 1992, when they had completed, to 2001, Dan met with 3 people a day, 7 days a week for 10 years. And you ask, how could he do that? God provides. He had a stipend inheritance from his family, $1,000 a month. He had simple needs and simple means, and he literally dedicated himself to doing this. Wow, are you kidding me? A person that man chooses, that God chooses in his season to be available to do this work full time. Unbelievable. And so he gets done with 10, I'm not exaggerating, 10,000 meetings with critical thinking people to go through the big book, go through these questions and fine tune and question, and is this in the text? Is this not in the text? And move it around and shape it. And here it is. In fact, he got so excited about music, have the spheres have their music, you know, in Bill's story, and he never knew where that came from, and people challenged him, and it said it took him a couple of years to find it, and he found out the answer, and he called the guy in Chicago in the middle of the night to tell him the answer, and the guy goes, thanks, Dan, but you could have told me in the morning. But Dan was excited. That's Dan, okay? Okay, so he ends up with these 10,000 meetings, and he publishes the first Big Book Awakening. He copyrighted it in 1992, and in the meantime, here's another parallel thing going on. Joe Hawk and Mark Houston are running around the country doing big book workshops every weekend, and they find, curiously, that they leave the premises and people are left with, you know, they don't know what to do. They had some tapes because Smile God Loves You tape service was doing these tapes for them, but they needed something else to leave behind with them to help them out. And so Joe talked to Dan and said, Dan, can we use your that workbook thing that you put together for me? And Dan said, sure, that'd be great. And so the stapled pages, typewritten pages, were mimeographed, and he sent them out with Joe and Mark, and they'd leave behind. And the interest in it was moderate, not very big. And then the next version that Dan did with his computer is he put it in the comb-bound volume, and the interest got bigger. And then finally, in 2001, it's 150 pages long in 14-point print, and he reduces it down to 12-point print, and he makes it an even 100 pages. And it's bound, and it's pretty, and it looks like the one you and I have today, the Big Book Awakening. And all of a sudden, it's selling like like Cracker Jacks. It's going off the table so fast they can't even keep them. And the thing is, people are having an experience with the Big Book. Dan said people in the 30s had a higher reading level than they do now. And he said, I wanted to reduce it by a reading level so everybody could have a chance to understand what the Big Book was trying to say. Okay? Wow. Just trying to have people understand the Big Book. And he said, I want to give a closing comment to Dan, and then I got a couple wrap-ups. And if you'll give me, I'm sorry, Michael, I'm going to go another 5 minutes into the time. I hope you're okay. Is it okay with that? Everybody, thumbs up.
That's
okay
exactly what you have. Keep going.
Okay.
Fire.
Okay. Thank you. I am speechless. I'm trying not to cry, guys. When I think of this history and what God has done, oh man. Sorry. Dan had a humble heart, guys. Dan had a humble heart. He had a love in his heart for this program. He wanted to see people that couldn't get it. And he said, quote, I feel uncomfortable when people thank me that I wrote the Big Book Awakening workbook, like it's something he did. He said, it doesn't sit well with me. It's just the big book cleared with what got in the way of people understanding this big book. I dropped it down a grade level so people could understand. But I had 10,000 meetings with people over 10 years that helped me write this. He never took credit. He never took credit for being the author of the work. It was principles before personalities with Dan. And that's the way he lived his life. By the way, Dan died April the 14th, 5 years ago. We just got done a couple days ago. So, you know, I'm a little bit emotional about it, but he was a good man. Okay, let's see. I'm going to do a little wrap up here. I've talked about most of the stuff I wanted to talk about with you guys. My personal experience was, you know, Karen, my wife, and I, Karen had direct sponsorship and familiarity with Don Pritz. My sponsor, Bill Tanner, who I owe my life to, was sponsored by Don Pritz and the gang. And they were the first people that showed me hope. And Don Pritz used to say this, and he had love in his heart too. He said, sobriety without solution is cruelty. Sobriety without solution is cruelty. And he said, solution, the truth, without love is brutality. And I try to always remember that as I'm taking people through, because that's the experience that I had with Bill Tanner, Bill T. So, you know, Karen and I got exposed to BBA, and I don't have time to go into it. I guess God's got different plans, so that's fine. But I do want to say one thing. I get out here after being exposed to Mark Houston and Joe Hawk, and I am on fire. I can't even believe these guys. You know, I knew Don Pritz. I went to Don Pritz's meeting. He had an AA group whose name of his meeting on Friday mornings at 6 a.m. at St. Joe's Hospital in downtown Denver. And then he was a member of this thing called the God Squad. And, you know, he was a humble man, involved in all three parts of the triangle. And when I got out here, and I knew he sponsored Joe and Mark, but I didn't know Joe ever. And I knew Mark only a little bit. A lot of people knew Joe or Mark really, really well. Tyler will talk about that part of the history tonight probably. But here's the point. I got out here and I'm so on fire. This is such an incredible message. And I call up, I'm involved in AA General Service, always have been, so is Karen. And we float this idea to AA General Service in Area 8 of San Diego. We say, hey, Joe Hawk and Mark Houston, they're available to come in. I've talked to them. They are available to come in for a weekend in the big book. Can we book them? Can we do this as an area event? Well, you would have thought I was asking Satan come speak at a Baptist church. It was not received well. I will just put it that way. And as a result, you know, BBA in San Diego was not a welcome commodity. We couldn't even be listed. In fact, to this day, we're not listed in the area meetings. But it's not about retaliation. It's not about resentments or anything else. It's just a misunderstanding. But it comes full circle. In 2021, January this year, AA Area Assembly 8 asked me to come and give a history of BBA. That was in 2004 when I got here. And 17 years later, because of the impact that BBA is having, and you can't even wait till you hear Tyler tonight, honest to God, a saint from God, the impact that BBA has in people's lives, they said, we've got to hear about it. It took 17 years for General A to hear about it, but it was okay. They heard about it. Okay, I got 3 wrap-ups and then questions for you. In the preface, this is directly out of the BBA workbook. Dan had us write in the very beginning of the preface. He said, this is more than a book designed to transmit information. It's a book designed to transmit an experience sufficient enough to enable me to recover. I need more than knowledge to stay sober for good. Boom, boom. Table of contents. Dan had us write this out of the Big Book Awakening. This is a textbook meant to be done in order. This outlines where each step is found in the big book. And then on the title page, the first promise of hope, the story of how many thousands of men and women were recovered from alcoholism. A promise. If action in the three areas, unity, service, and recovery, is taken, you and I in this phone, you and I in this Zoom call, we can be whole. Closing comment, not my words, these are Dan's words, and then I'm done, Michael. Thank you for the extra time. The opening line in Dan's introduction, here it is, these two quotes, and we're all done. The opening line in Dan's introduction in the Big Book Awakening says this, and I love, this is Dan's heart. This book was not written to replace the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was written as a tool to be used in conjunction with the Big Book. And he closes this introduction with this. It's important to have an open mind and remember to keep your focus on your personal experience and not on your knowledge of the Big Book of this or this program. Knowledge, this book, Big Book, or any human power, including meetings, cannot by itself keep you sober. Don't worship the process. Remember that all these things are what takes you to that which will keep you sober. Closed off, Dan Sherman. It's not life on life's term, people. It's life on God's terms. I love you and thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Pat. We're going to now open for questions. And who would like to go first? Lynn, would you like to say something? Lynn W.?
Oh boy, Lynn. Lynn, I'm scared now.
Lynn.
Okay.
There you go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn. I'm an addict, compulsive overeater, and I'm emotional as you are, Pat. I don't have questions. I just want to thank you so much. You know, with the 5-year anniversary of his passing, it's been emotional as well. And this is such a celebration of Big Book Awakening, and it saved my life. And the fact that I have a God in my life because of this process, and the fact that I had the privilege of knowing Dan later in life. I love hearing the early days because I wasn't there. I know Dave has his hand up and he knows Dan even longer. I just want to thank you. It's just beautiful. I try and hear your histories every time because it just brings me peace and joy. And that's all I wanted to say. So thanks.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. And then Catherine, do you have your hand up?
Hi, Pat. I was just wondering, I usually describe, because I'm from San Diego and I came up against that prejudice that central office had and stuff. And I was just wondering, I usually just describe BBA as a way of working the steps, a sponsorship lineage, information that's been handed down from sponsor to sponsee. And a lot of the information is stuff that was written in the margins of big books of guys going back, and some of them you described. I understood, but there's one question I have, like one of the Pauls, there's something with one of those Pauls that goes directly back to Akron, and I was just wondering what that was. Yep. Thank you.
Paul Martin, who was sponsored by Paul Stanley, and Paul Stanley was sponsored by Dr. Bob. That's where it goes. And Dr. Bob from Akron. Good question. And his story's in the big book. It's, oh shoot, the truth will set you free. I want to say it's in the original. If you have the Experience, Strength, and Hope volume that has all the stories out of the big book, it's in there. I'll think of it. I was going to read a portion of it, but we ran out of time. So good question, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. Dave, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi. My name's Dave Martell. I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic, compulsive overeater, nicotine addict. Pat, that was fantastic. I just want to say that picture is Dan Sherman.
It is. I couldn't see. I couldn't get my eyes to
okay.
focus. That scared me. I was going, that's Dan.
And there's two pictures that prominently hang in my house. This one is in the Dan Sherman screening room. I called Dan the greatest salesman. He got me to the finish line of one of my biggest fears of buying a house. Because of Alcoholics Anonymous, I had a quality problem. My accountant said I needed to buy a house. Like, you weren't married, no kids, you need a tax write-off, and definitely afraid. But it's an amazing story. But I just want to say that Dan was just an amazing man, a humble guy. I remember driving down to San Diego with him. He said, I got to speak in San Diego. I didn't know anything about Big Book Awakenings. And by the way, every time we went and looked at a house, and he would see a big room or a guest house in the back, he'd say, that would be a great place for a workshop.
Aww.
I'm like, I'm the client, man. This is about me. He's selfish, so many stories, but it was really, I just want to say it was such an honor, that he requested. I didn't know this with Lynn and his brother, that I MC his memorial, and it was one of the greatest honors of my life. I've done that for a few sober guys, and I just want to say that what he said, the Big Book Awakenings, which I have never done actually. I've been through the book, I've done the 4-column inventory, and Dan coached me, and and it's kind of on my bucket list. But it really is, it's a tool, and he said it. You said it at the end. It's a tool to support people. My men's stag that I go to, my 350 guys, regular Big Book meeting, regular meeting.
Yeah.
He taught one guy how to go through the steps, and it influenced so many guys that couldn't stay sober.
Yeah.
It's just another way. It's another avenue to get to God, to get to spirituality, and it really is. He was divinely channeled, just like Bill and Bob was. And you just knocked it out of the park. I'm so glad I showed up for this. And,
buddy, thank you. That means a lot coming from you, because I tell you what, I tried to do honor to Dan, and those are big feet.
Yeah, and he was a humble heart. When we went down to San Diego, I couldn't believe like the crowd that showed up, and he was like a rock star. Like, I know a Beatle, I know a guy that's been on the moon. And I said to Dan, I said, thank God you brought me here, man. I got to keep you grounded. You're just another drunk, Dan. Remember, I know who you are. And really miss that guy, and you just really did service to everything. Thank you so much.
Hey, Dave, call me when you got my number on here.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you at some point. Seriously, if you
Sure.
call me, and that'd be great. I'd love to take you through it if you want. Seriously,
it would be an honor.
Experience it. Okay?
Absolutely, I've been wanting to
You
do
call
that.
me.
Absolutely, and I love you and miss Dan. And I just want to say, Dan, I have this house, and it's a whole new set of problems. There's always something breaking down. Dan, I'm gonna get you for this. Have a great day, everybody.
Hilarious.
I love you guys. Yes.
Love you. Thank you.
Lighten up. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to help transition from one meeting to the next. So the next leader is going to take over here in just a moment, and we're going to have Steve, one of my good friends from Sydney, and we're going to work on 4-step inventory. Judith has a question. If we could push it into under 2 minutes, that would be wonderful. Go, Judith.
Hi, no, just a statement. Pat, wow, thank you. I was nearly in tears when you mentioned about AA too, that they've accepted us now. Just bottom line, you guys have changed my life. Dan's work brought my program to life after 25 years. And I'm from London. I got the privilege of bringing it in with a couple other people. We put it on the map. We opened a live meeting. I mean, we went as far, and now it's going crazy in Europe. It's fantastic. And we're connected to you guys all through Skype. And I've, my thing is, I got such a delight in coming down to San Diego whenever I flew over to San Francisco to meet you and Tyler and you guys. This stuff has completely changed us. But I'll tell you this, I'm in Compulsive Overeaters Anonymous. As soon as we opened a live meeting and called it BBA OA, we got shut down. And we just said, there's a choice. Either we're OA or BBA. And we just said, you know what? For now, we just got to be BBA because we're not diluting that message. So stick to it, and it works. And it is a lifesaver. You guys, you laid that path for us. And the history, Pat, You are the go-to man. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And now we're going to go ahead and get ready for our next speaker, which is Stephen S., and he's going to be talking to us on Step 4 Resentment Inventory.
All
and
right.
Pat, thank you very much for your share today.
You're welcome, Susan. Thank you for having me.